You are standing in your kitchen, slicing into a loaf of bread, and something feels different right away. The crust crackles and breaks instead of giving softly. Inside, the crumb is full of large, uneven holes. Then comes the taste, a gentle tang that ordinary bread does not usually have. This is sourdough. And that is where the real question begins. How can something made from flour, water, salt, and a little yeast end up tasting so different from the bread most people eat every day? What exactly is changing inside that dough? And why has sourdough earned a reputation for being healthier than other kinds of bread? Is that reputation deserved, or is it another food myth that sounds better than it really is? Let's get into it right here on Secrets of Simple Things. What sourdough actually is. At its core, sourdough is bread that rises through natural fermentation rather than depending entirely on commercial baker's yeast. Most modern bread is made with a packaged yeast strain chosen because it works quickly and predictably. Sourdough works more slowly. Instead of relying on a single added yeast, sourdough uses a starter, a living mixture of flour and water populated by wild yeast and beneficial bacteria. These microbes feed on the flour and transform the dough over time. The ingredients are not exotic. What makes sourdough distinctive is the way time and fermentation turn familiar ingredients into something more complex in flavor, texture, and character. From the outside, it still looks like bread. But inside, sourdough is not just a recipe. It is a living process. The ancient origin of fermented bread. To understand sourdough properly, it helps to step back to a time before commercial yeast and before anyone knew what microbes even were. Long before people could name yeast or bacteria, they were already using them. Archaeological evidence suggests that fermented bread was being made in ancient Egypt around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. No one knows exactly how the first loaf happened, but the most likely explanation is also the most human one. A mixture of grain and water was left sitting too long. It began to bubble. Something invisible had changed it. And when that dough was baked, the bread came out lighter, softer, and more flavorful than the flat, dense breads people were used to. They may not have understood the science, but they understood results. Humans have always noticed when something works better and tastes better. So natural fermentation stayed. For most of human history, sourdough was simply the normal way bread was made. That changed in the 19th century, when commercial yeast became widely available. Bread could now be made faster and more predictably, and sourdough gradually disappeared from many everyday kitchens. But it did not disappear everywhere. How San Francisco became linked to sourdough. One of the most famous holdouts was San Francisco, where sourdough became woven into the city's identity. The connection grew during the California gold rush in the mid-20th century, when miners and settlers lived under unstable conditions and needed food systems they could trust. A sourdough starter made sense. It did not depend on store-bought yeast. It could be carried, fed, and kept alive for long stretches of time. For people living far from dependable supply lines, that mattered. Over time, sourdough became strongly associated with San Francisco itself. Part of that reputation comes from the region's climate and local microbial communities, which many bakers believe helped shape the bread's distinctive character. An ancient bread, carried by necessity, became a food symbol of an entire city. But to understand why each loaf can develop a character of its own, we have to look at the living system hidden inside it. The living ecosystem, inside the starter. A sourdough starter may look like nothing more than flour mixed with water, but that is only its surface. In reality, it is a living ecosystem. The two main players are wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. Wild yeast feeds on carbohydrates in the flour and produces carbon dioxide. That gas becomes trapped in the dough, helping it rise and forming the air pockets that later turn into the large, uneven holes inside the loaf. The bacteria produce organic acids, especially lactic acid and acetic acid. Those acids are what give sourdough its tang, whether mild and rounded or sharper and more pronounced. So the flavor is not something added afterward. It is built slowly from within. That partnership is the key. Sourdough is not the work of one organism doing one job. Yeast helps create lift. Bacteria build flavor, acidity, and a less welcoming environment for harmful microbes. Together, they turn a simple mixture into something deeper than ordinary bread. The open crumb, the slight sourness, and the loaf's sense of character all begin with this invisible community quietly working inside the starter. How a sourdough starter is made. The strange thing is that this ecosystem does not need to be bought in a packet. It can begin with something simple: flour and water. Mix the two together and leave them at room temperature. In the first few days, different microorganisms begin to appear and compete. The smell can be odd because the mixture is not stable yet. Microbes arrive from the flour itself, from the air, and even from the baker's hands. But with time, the balance shifts. Wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria gradually take over, forming a culture that can keep reproducing and working together. Once that happens, the starter develops bubbles, smells gently sour, and becomes strong enough to raise dough. To keep it alive, bakers feed it with fresh flour and water. With proper care, a starter can survive for years, decades, even generations. Some bakeries maintain starters said to be more than a century old. What looks like a quiet jar of paste is actually something people maintain almost like a living companion. And once it becomes active, it starts changing the bread itself. What fermentation changes in the bread. The first change is the easiest to see. As wild yeast works through the flour, it releases carbon dioxide. That gas forms pockets inside the dough, and in the oven, those pockets expand, creating the open crumb sourdough is known for. But fermentation also changes structure. During a slow rise, enzymes in the flour begin breaking down some starches and proteins. Gluten develops gradually over time rather than being rushed. The result is a loaf that feels chewier, more elastic, and more layered in texture. Then there is the crust. When sourdough is baked in a hot oven, especially with steam, the exterior forms a thick crackling shell. That crust adds texture, but it also helps trap moisture inside. Fermentation changes freshness too. The acids in the dough make the environment less friendly to certain unwanted microbes, which helps explain why sourdough often stays fresh longer than many fast-made breads. And that is the deeper pattern. What you see, touch, and chew all leads back to the same cause: slow fermentation. The crust is not random. The open interior is not random. Even the deeper flavor is not random. But if all sourdough is built this way, why do some loaves taste only gently tangy while others are unmistakably sour? Why sourdough never tastes exactly the same. There is no single universal sourdough flavor. That is part of what makes it so interesting. Temperature changes the speed of fermentation. Time changes how far it goes. Different flours bring different nutrients and behavior. Hydration changes how the dough develops. Even the way a baker feeds and maintains a starter can shift its balance. And place matters too. Local communities of yeast and bacteria can differ from one environment to another. Change those conditions, and you change the relationship between yeast and bacteria. That changes how much acid develops, how the dough behaves, and how the final loaf tastes. So one sourdough may be only lightly tangy while another has a sharper, more noticeable sourness. Sourdough is not a fixed flavor. It is a negotiation between ingredients, environment, and time. And because it is so closely tied to fermentation and slowness, sourdough has also picked up another reputation: being healthier. But how true is that, really? The health claim: true, partly true, or oversold. This is the part that often gets overstated. Sourdough is frequently talked about as if it belongs in a different category from ordinary bread, almost as if fermentation turns it into something automatically superior. The truth is more measured than that. Sourdough fermentation can break down some phytates, compounds in grains that bind certain minerals. As a result, minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium may become a bit more available to the body. The long fermentation process may also make the bread feel easier to digest for some people. But that does not make sourdough a miracle food. And it certainly does not mean every sourdough loaf is automatically healthier than every other kind of bread. A lot still depends on the flour used, how the bread is made, what else is added, and how much of it is eaten. So the better way to think about sourdough is not as a magical exception, but as bread shaped by a slower process that can bring certain benefits in some cases. And maybe the best way to understand sourdough is not to argue over whether it is miraculous, but to eat it in a way that lets its real character come through. The 5-second rule for better sourdough. If you want to taste what makes sourdough special, here is a simple rule. Warm a slice, then wait 5 seconds before taking the first bite. That small pause matters more than it sounds. The heat wakes the crust back up, bringing back some of its crackle. It also lifts the aroma, so the bread smells more alive and more distinctly fermented. And those few seconds give the steam and moisture inside the slice just enough time to settle, making the contrast between crisp crust and tender interior easier to notice. It is a tiny habit, but it reveals something important. Sourdough is satisfying not just because of its ingredients, but because texture, aroma, and fermentation arrive together in the same moment. The bigger idea. Inside a simple loaf. From the outside, sourdough seems almost plain. Flour, water, salt, and a little life. But inside that loaf is something much larger. Invisible microbes, slow time, patient care, and a tradition older than modern food science. People were baking bread like this long before they understood what yeast was, what bacteria were, or why fermentation worked at all. They only knew that something alive was happening and that it made bread better. That is a reminder that many familiar things are not truly simple. They only feel simple because we stopped looking closely. Sourdough is not just bread with a slight tang. It is one of the clearest examples of how time and life can turn something ordinary into something deeper. If there is another everyday thing you want us to look at more closely, leave it in the comments. Subscribe for more hidden stories inside simple things.